Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to the next in our series of wonderful 20 seminars. So I'm sure today will not disappoint. Today we have Conor and Lucie, and they're going to talk to us very important the myths as well as the realities of cyberbullying. So thank you very much. Conor, just go on.
Thanks, Claire. I suppose everybody already knows I'm not Lucie, so I'm the Conor part of the equation. I suppose these lunchtime things, they can sometimes drag a little bit. We'll try not to make it drag too much. So, as they say, whenever you come in, take a smile, sit down, relax, have your sandwich, and we'll take you through the next 15 minutes and see how we go. It is that thing about new technology and the curse of new technology, and everybody pathologizes everything with technology, as opposed to all the positive educational stuff that Keith and Elizabeth and people in Craig are doing. When the sewing machine was introduced, people thought there were huge implications, women moving their legs up and down, and the sexuality of that, and it would affect their sexuality. Not so far back for people who aren't part of the digital age. The Walkman was viewed as an evil device. People would be listening to it, and they'd be encouraged to disappear into separate worlds, and they wouldn't communicate with each other. So just with everything, there's always this pathologizing of what's going to happen. But hopefully we'll try and give you an idea around myths and realities, and it'd be great because Lucie's going to share some of her research results today as well. The usual government health warning whenever people like myself and Lucie as psychologists, whenever we get involved with things, it has the potential to raise issues for people in the audience, whether you have been bullied previously at school or know people that are being bullied or victimised. So again, just be careful with yourself, and again, if we're making comments at the end, please don't name anybody or any school or any environment, so that we don't have to be embarrassed about that and think of duty of care. Always like this one. By banning YouTube in schools, we hope to stop bullying in cyberspace and get it back in the playground where it belongs. We were sort of getting to the point where we had really good information, good knowledge about how to counter, prevent, intervene with traditional bullying, and then along came all of the cyberspace stuff as well. Myself and Lucie are very keen just to acknowledge that whilst we're doing this, we're just two out of a few people from the school. Genevieve here is doing stuff, Leanne, Murray, Stephen, Mona's been doing stuff, Joe's doing good research at the minute, positive psychology, cyberbullying, and lots of other people. So this isn't just about myself and Lucie, this is all the influence that we get from, of course, Genevieve and everybody else that we work with as well. I guess we can move it on. Sort of the area of cyberbullying, it is very, very, very fast moving, even to the point, we like these lyrics from John Prine, we're living in the future, I'll tell you how I know, we read it in the paper 15 years ago. So even what we were planning to do last week changes to this week because of the new research that's coming out. And it's been really hard for Lucie whenever she was doing her research. It's almost every time she got a chapter done or something else done, a whole swathe of new research was coming on. But I think the good thing where Lucie was in terms of research, Lucie was at that couple of days, she was engaged with all of the people, to the point that anybody that Lucie was ever referencing were people that she knew actually face to face and has been in communication with. So this area is really fast moving, and there's a little debate and dialogue that's ongoing at the minute, and Lucie will allude to that a little bit later. But it is around myths and realities of where we're at. But before we get to cyberbullying, I think it's useful to have a whistle-stop tour again of just thinking about traditional bullying and what we know or what we think we know about that. And then what is the overlap or the link between that and cyberbullying? Or are they two completely separate things? Or are they not? Are they two sides of the one coin? So it really is that proverbial white elephant. Hard to describe, but if you're being bullied or victimized, you pretty much know about it. And then we always have this problem when we start to research things that everybody in society talks about. Like, if we go to the garden centre, we go looking for a columna vulgaris, which is just a heather. We don't call it a heather, we use fancy Latin names. But for the kind of stuff we're interested in, we do use stress at work. We use the common everyday language. And sometimes these things become so useless, there's no point talking now. You know, if I said, hands up, anybody who's stressed at work, sure, the ceiling would fall in around us. Genevieve's research, the workplace bullying stuff, a lot of that was happening, and people were talking about it before we even knew what it is we're talking about. So really, does the lay view, and that view that's been propagated in the news, the media, all the stuff about Ask FM, the the pathologizing, does that map on to the reality of what the research is telling us? And again, Lucie will be giving some interesting stuff around even the definition of what we're talking about. So really have a think about this as we move through, because Lucie will come back to this. So what is it? And then in terms of the traditional bullying, where we've got to in the literature over the past 20 or 30 years is some kind of an understanding that no matter how you describe it, it's probably going to come down to these three criteria. There's going to be some kind of aggressive behaviour or intentional harm done. That's going to be carried out generally, repeatedly and over time, with the caveat that in some circumstances, maybe just one incident is going to be serious enough to constitute it. And an interpersonal relationship characterised by some imbalance of power. And that's not always going to be physical imbalance of power. So the question then starts to come in, if these are the criteria that we sort of accept for traditional sort of face-to-face playground bullying, to what extent will they be the same for cyberbullying, or is it actually a completely different thing? The next thing that comes after that is really the prevalence, and how many are involved, how many are victims, how many are bullies, how many are bully victims, and how many are bystanders. And it's the big question around cyberbullying. Is the traditional stuff still sort of going along, just plateauing out 30, 40%? And is the cyberbullying actually increasing year by year? As much as we do a lot of the fancy stats and we love our stats and stuff, we actually sort of say, look, the fractions and percentages are coming back. I always remember doing research in the north, and they were saying, look, Conor, you can do all the fancy stats, but Martin McGuinness and David Trimble, they only understand 8 out of 10 said this, 7 out of 10 want that. In terms of the prevalence, and it becomes a bit of a nonsense thing, because it depends on the time reference period, in the past week, the past 2 months, the past year, all the different kind of criteria, we're always going to come up with something. And it's that kind of case, would the real number please stand up? We don't really know. So we get into the myths and the realities then of the traditional stuff. And we do have to take a look at society and as educators. It's your headmaster, Fatty, he's worried you're being bullied at school. So the kind of stuff that goes on at home and the influence of that. As they always say up at home, they don't lick it off the stones. So the myths and the realities of where this actually starts. So the whole role of society, media, new media, and even the broadcast media, and I suppose something that I always get shocked at is, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we actually encourage people to go, you are the weakest link. So why would we be doing that? Why is there a watershed at 9 o'clock for certain things, but we allow other things to be on for kids, for entertainment? They pick up this notion of low-level aggression. Low-level aggression is okay. I can go into the playground, I can do that. So again, at societal levels, we do need to think about this. Even at the point we say, you can't grasp people, you can't tell people. Well, that's what we actually want children to be able to do. Janet set aside an hour each day to work on her threatening letters. So boys and girls are a little bit different in how they bully, myths and realities. It used to be that girls didn't bully, but that's just because we didn't actually include them in the research. Then when we did include them in the research, we actually categorised it by sort of male-focused views of aggression. And then we always have the problem, especially with primary school kids, no parent wants to admit that their little girl with little ponytails and a little pep school bag could be a bully. So again, confronting the myths and realities of what's out there. Sort of leading up to the cyber stuff, and we're sort of using this new types, and there's always this focus on new types come along, but really and truly, are the new types. We've always had the prejudicial stuff, the homophobic stuff, which is getting huge airplay because it's been linked into the government stuff, because the gay lobby is quite strong at forcing public policy. The special ed, the disability stuff, myself and Noel were doing. Very focused in the UK on sexist, sexual and transphobic bullying. We can't even talk about it over here. It's back to sex education, we're not allowed to do these kind of things. So maybe we do need to take things a little bit more further forward, myths and realities. If we don't do it as educators, parents and society, they're going to pick it up in the playground. And are we not better giving them the real information? So are they new types, or are they just, again, two sides of the one coin? And then we've got the cyberbullying, which takes us to the cyber world and the world that young people are living in. Not going to go into it, but this is all the kind of stuff I'm sure that Elizabeth and Keith and all of our colleagues in Crike are all interested in, all of the very positive uses of technology. Again, let's not pathologise the whole thing. There are a lot of good uses. But the paradox is that that whilst the internet is the most open form of communication, it's also the most anonymous. And whenever I first saw that, it actually caught me and I was thinking, yeah, that's actually true. I never thought about it like that. And then this one becomes very true. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Okay, so we get away with anything on the internet. And it's about, again, thinking back to the sewing machine, thinking back to the Walkman. Here we have the internet, here we have all of the wired devices. We're at the stage now where we have more wired devices than we actually have human beings. So we've actually gone through that barrier at this stage. So really, a lot of this leads to, if the new technology is there, how do we use it and how do we cope with it? We do have all of the negative stuff, which we've all read about, even stuff that Gary and Monica are doing around stuff in Second Life, where people create avatars and they can actually go off and they can visit little islands and experience what it would be like to be a paedophile if they would like to do that. The kind of stuff that Monica's doing that would cut across Aidan's kind of research, the ethics, the morals. Can you actually now have a divorce in the real life because your avatar is having an affair in Second Life? So that, interactive dualism, I suppose, that bit of this kind of might be. But there's a lot of the negative stuff, and that's where we're at as well with this kind of research. At this stage, that's a sort of a whistle-stop background, the traditional stuff to think about, some myths, some realities. And I want to hand over to Lucie now. Lucie will go through some of her research. It'll come back to me, and then we'll go back to Lucie again.
Thanks. Okay, so just to pick up from where Conor left off with the definitions of traditional bullying, if you remember, he said that the kind of key criteria for recognising traditional bullying were intention to cause harm, repetition over time, and a power imbalance. So how does that differ in the cyber world? Does it really still apply? Well, taking repetition, it can take on a very different form in a cyber setting. So if I put up a humiliating video of Conor just once, but then 500 people like that video and 1,000 people share it and 600 comment on it, well, Conor's experiencing a very repetitive kind of victimization. But I've only taken one action, so is all the blame on me? Do I take full responsibility for that? Or does everybody share responsibility? So it does take a very different form in a cyber setting. Another issue is the power imbalance. So in a real world setting, we'd kind of think of power in terms of maybe physical size, social status, intellect. But do those things hold any weight in a cyber setting? So some would argue that this ability to remain anonymous, if you can hide your identity, is that a form of power? Is it a form of power if you're particularly skilled at technology? If you can hack someone's account, if you're very skilled with Photoshop, is that a form of power? Or is it the fact that now we can literally harass somebody or dish out abuse 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as long as we have a connection to the internet, whether it's a smartphone or even just a normal mobile phone or a computer. So where it used to be that at the end of the school day we could go home and seek refuge, that's not necessarily the case anymore. The abuse can continue on. And also this idea of the potentially massive audience. You're literally talking about the World Wide Web. And there are very famous cases where a relatively small cyberbullying incident has been blown up into a massive trauma because it's viewed by literally millions of people, who not only view it, but share it, manipulate it, add to the distress of the victim. And then when we think about the kind of detachment that can be associated with online communication, if I, again, taking the example of me dishing out some abuse to Conor, if I say something nasty to him, or if I barge him into the corridor wall, I might see a reaction. So he might betray his feelings through his body language or his facial expression or the sound of his voice. But do I get that in an online setting? Do I see that impact if I'm physically removed from him? So not always. So we have to call into question how well these criteria fit with the cyber setting. Something we do know with a good degree of certainty at this point is that there's a very strong connection between victimization in the real world and in the cyber world. So if you're being cyberbullied, there's a very good chance you're also being bullied within the school. And that can start this kind of cycle of abuse that's very hard to escape. And something that begins in one setting can very easily transfer to the other. So I might have an embarrassing picture put up on Facebook that I really don't like. It's not confined to that. It can be the talk of the classroom the next day. So where we kind of make this distinction between the real world and the cyber world as not being a real thing, young people don't necessarily make that distinction. It's more like an extension. Okay, I'm not going to get bogged down in every type or category of cyberbullying, but just to give you an example, you might wonder, well, how can you exclude someone in a cyber setting? They can go wherever they want, they can look at whatever sites they want. But I can even think of an example from before cyberbullying was even a word, when my generation was first getting heavily involved in chat rooms. So they go home from school at the end of the day and log into MSN and chat. And I can remember one particular person who every time they logged in, everybody else would log off. So it sends a really clear message. You're not wanted here. If you take the example of impersonation, sometimes it's just done in jest, but you could set up a Facebook profile of someone else and use it for really malicious purposes. And it's quite difficult for them to get that removed. So there are a whole range of ways you can attack someone online. So just to come back again to defining cyberbullying, what a lot of researchers have done is taken these existing criteria for traditional bullying: intention to cause harm, the power imbalance, the repetition, and they've really just plugged that into the cyber setting. And that's why we call it cyberbullying. And of course this extra component now with the electronic communication. One of the big problems that we face as parents, educators, but I suppose we're primarily focused as researchers, it's very difficult when we have all these definitions out there because they don't all follow these criteria. So we're all defining it in slightly different ways. We're all measuring cyberbullying and cyber aggression in different ways. And so how do we have consistency across the research if we're not even getting the fundamentals right? So, key question, what is it and how are we supposed to measure it? Okay, so a debate kind of began in the last couple of years. Dan Alveus is a very well-respected, highly regarded voice in the bullying literature. He would have been one of the pioneers of bullying research. And when he says something, people tend to pay attention. So he has said very little about cyberbullying, but he weighed in on the debate in 2012 and he basically said everyone needs to just calm down, not get hysterical over cyberbullying. It's actually a very low prevalence phenomenon. There's all this talk about how it's increasing over time, it's more detrimental than traditional bullying. But in fact, he says, the problem is researchers are focusing on cyberbullying in isolation. If we look at it in relation to traditional bullying, it's very low prevalence. He also says we can't sort of draw in every form of cyber aggression when we want to measure cyberbullying, then it's going to be blown out of proportion. What's the definition? It needs to be narrow and focused. And he refers to his own research. So he's conducted research in Norway, he's collaborated with researchers in the US, and they found that taking different time points with a very large sample, there was no change over time. Cyberbullying tended to remain very stable. It wasn't growing every year. He also refers to research that shows that it's not necessarily more affecting than traditional bullying. So there's not this really negative effect over and above traditional bullying. So ultimately what he says is, it's just a subtype of bullying. Let's not put all our energies into this. We need to keep our eye on the ball with traditional bullying. So there was a response from Peter Smith, who's also a very highly respected contributor to the bullying literature, who people also tend to listen to when he says something. And he says, yes, all of that is correct, but there are these characteristics that make cyberbullying unique, and so we need to look at it in a different way. These are things I would have talked about in the first slide. He also says, okay, it doesn't have a worse effect necessarily than traditional bullying, but when we look at those who are bullied in a multitude of ways, so he calls them polyvictims, so they suffer victimization through cyber and traditional methods, they have the worst outcomes. So this actually is important to consider. The combination can have a very detrimental effect. Okay. So then, just taking a completely alternative view, Dorothy Grigg put forward this argument, which not that many people it's like she said it and nobody heard it, because there's very little attention has been paid to this. She says, look, these aspects of the power imbalance, the repetition, they don't really fit into the cyber context. We don't have any evidence that having superior technological skills is a source of power, that cyberbullies don't seem to have superior technological skills. The repetition takes a different form. How do we decide who's responsible? Going back to that example, am I responsible because I started it, or is it also shared, is the blame shared with the other 500 people who joined in? So this becomes really important for legislation and policy. So we need to find a definition that works. So she suggests, well, why are we so focused on cyberbullying? Why aren't we looking at cyber aggression at large? Why aren't we looking at things like happy slapping and harassment and stalking? Why focus so much on the cyberbullying? So it's not necessarily the case that Smith or Grigg or Alveus, any one of them is absolutely right, but they all make very important points that we need to consider. Okay, so just coming on to the research that Conor and I have conducted in the last couple of years, we wanted to get a good picture of what was going on in Ireland, get a good representative sample from the country, and we looked at about 2,500 secondary school students. We replicated, or partially replicated, a study that was being done by some Swiss colleagues. So we used their measures, and we wanted to try and tease out this issue around the cyberbullying, cyber aggression debate. Is the definition working? Are we capturing the prevalence well with the measures we're using? So we took two approaches to look at the same problem. We gave them a very clear definition of what cyberbullying is. We labelled it very clearly as cyberbullying, and then we asked, have you been cyberbullied in the last 3 months? And they could indicate whether it was anywhere on the scale from never to almost every day. Then we looked at it a slightly different way, using the measure that was created by our colleagues. We took this 9-point scale. It looks at behaviours that are very much recognised as cyberbullying behaviours, but we didn't call it anything. So for convenience, we'll just label it cyber aggression. But we didn't give it any name, we didn't define it, we simply asked them, have you experienced these behaviours? If so, how often? Okay, so what we found was, looking at traditional bullying, you can see that we found that about 50% of the sample had experienced these behaviours once or twice. We wouldn't consider that bullying necessarily because it's not repetitive enough. Strangely, we found that they were more likely to be frequent victims rather than occasional. So this is once a week or more often, and this is once a month or more often. So 14 to 15% experiencing victimization once a week or more often. Then if you look at cyberbullying, this is our one item question, you'd have to agree with all this. It's a very low prevalence phenomenon, because 1 in 10 experiencing it once or twice in the last 3 months, 1% experiencing it occasionally or frequently. It's extremely low. But when we look at cyber aggression then, there's a pretty substantial difference. The same behaviour, but measured in different ways, defined differently, given a label, you get much lower rates. So this is almost as frequent as traditional, and you have 1 in 20 experiencing it occasionally or frequently. So it kind of begs the question, well, does this term cyberbullying actually work? Is it serving its purpose for researchers or practitioners? There seems to be this kind of disconnect between what we as researchers consider to be cyberbullying and what young people recognise as cyberbullying. So is the answer now that we need to educate them as to what cyberbullying means to fit our purposes? Probably not. So we need to really think about whether the term cyberbullying works, or is it too restricted? Do we need to throw it out and start again? Okay, so we also looked at effects. We wanted to look at correlates of involvement in bullying and aggression. Not surprisingly, it was very much consistent with the literature. We found that involvement in any of those three, cyber-aggression, traditional bullying, cyberbullying, was associated with worse mental health outcomes. We measured mental health with two kind of indicators, a depressive symptom scale and a psychological well-being scale. Psychological well-being meaning positive emotions, satisfaction with life. What kind of stood out was that it was the frequent victims, those who were being victimised in some form once a week or more often. They really stood out across the board as having the most negative markers for mental health. We also isolated the different types of aggression or bullying in order to see what seemed to have the most effect, and similar to what Alves was saying, we found that traditional bullying was the strongest predictor of impaired mental health. But having said that, in support of what Smith says, it was the poly victims, the ones who experienced the range of negative experiences, who showed the highest levels of impaired mental health. We also wanted to look at this qualitatively, so to try and capture in some way what the individual experience was, because we were really conscious of the limitations of just having a scale measure. You don't get that insight into the individual. And we got a range of responses. So a large enough minority said that they really weren't bothered by the abuse they got online. This was purely online. They weren't bothered. They felt like the bullies or the aggressors were pathetic. It wasn't worth their time getting upset about. Then we had a large majority who felt hurt, upset, angry. A substantial amount of distress came through in their answers. And then we had a small group, very small, who seemed to have experienced quite worrying levels of distress. So they talked about feeling worthless, talked about thoughts of suicide. They were in the minority, but they were the ones who experienced the most frequent and biggest range of victimization. So we're going to move on to coping. I'll let Conor take over.
Yeah, it's interesting, some stuff that Lucie's talked on, like the impersonation and stuff like that. I was just reading stuff yesterday, the notion of joyriding, and not joyriding as we know in Belfast and stuff like that, but joyriding, that people are very easily stealing other people's handles on Twitter and stuff and then going for a joyride with their account. And there's a very big legal case just being settled in the States. Some guy who had the @N, they were very, he was offered 50,000 just to buy it and stuff because of marketing and that. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and it's not just with kids, it's with adults and stuff as well. So lots of myths and realities come through there, even in terms of, are we calling it cyberbullying or cyber aggression, or what are kids talking about? If we go out to research and they're talking about something else, it's completely different. But back to the sewing machine and the Walkman, there are always going to be new developments. And really, myself and Lucie were involved in a couple of large-scale European projects in the past few years, and we were sort of managing one of the big work packages, which was about coping, and coping at national level, coping at family level, school level, personal level. So coping becomes the big issue. But again, myths and realities in terms of coping, and I suppose mental health and the good work that Headstrong are doing, and the My World survey and things like that. There is a lot of stuff in the media, and of course Lucie, myself, Genevieve, a lot of us involved in this area are very, very loath to get involved in these kind of discussions, because we know that there's a lot of the story actually behind it. The newspapers love these kind of stuff. The stuff about Ask FM, should we get rid of Ask FM? Well, if you get rid of that, you're going to replace it with something else, and then we're back to where we are. So let's deal with it, let's cope with it, let's give people the coping skills that they need. So a lot of the media stuff, as I'm saying, related to it, but it's rarely the sole cause. And it's interesting, some of the new research, the blog stuff coming out of the States, and this is just the new stuff. They've been trawling the internet, looking at all of these alleged cases stuff. And what they're getting to is that, you know, it's probably linked to traditional bullying, to something else, to mental health and well-being. So there's other things going on. So again, one of the myths and realities just for us to be aware of. Okay, so let's have a little think about coping. And when we think about coping, we're thinking about technology, the technology's going, emotional development, and do kids have the emotional repertoire that's needed for this? And very, very basic little graphs here, just the rate of normal human development, lifespan development, whether it's emotional development or whatever, and across time. So emotional development with kids is no different than when it was whenever we were growing up. They just develop at the same rate. You know, we don't have to throw Freud and Piaget and Erikson stuff out now because technology's here and now kids are going faster. So emotional development is just the same. It's just going a little trajectory as they go through their formative years. Then if you take the technology and if you take something, for example, Moore's Law, where Moore's Law would actually say in terms of microchip development, every microchip and every new generation should actually see and be able to make the next generation within the next 18 months so it becomes obsolete. So there's the exponential growth in terms of technological development going here. And we can see this, the things being developed and marketed for, you know, becoming obsolete within a few years. Put the two of them together and we can see that there's definitely a mismatch in the rate of growth and development here. And then of course we have this bit in the middle here, and that's the bit that we should be concerned about. And I use the word psychologist here, but let's take that as educationist, psychologist, whoever. This is the bit that we should be concerned about. The obvious gap between normal development and technology. What we do know from the literature, if I was to hit Aidan in the playground, push Michael Sheldon over or something like that, it's over and done with. We get the reaction, you know, I'm bigger than Aidan, Aidan's not going to push me back. Or he can have a good go, but it ain't going to happen. But when we take a look at the cyber stuff,
He'll be waiting for you outside.
as they say, just putting it out there. But what we do know with the cyberbullying stuff, because it's happening in bedrooms and it's happening at home, it's happening in the bus, the rate of escalation, like 40% of victims, 40% of cyber victims, when you ask them how do you cope, how do you respond, they respond instantaneously. Because Aidan doesn't see me. So Aidan does it, and then I respond quickly. And then all of a sudden it gets flamed, and it flames out of control. So 40% of them are getting involved in something, and the whole thing is, they just don't have the emotional repertoire to slow it down, to calm it down. Whether that's a technological solution to press the off button, or something like that. Or, you know, I think Lucie will talk about some of these after. So this is the bit that we should be interested in. The speed of technology is up. Children's emotional repertoire isn't there. And is that the role for psychology, as I've put there? Really for educators, is that our role? And is the answer coping strategies, whether it's at the personal level, at the curriculum level? Emma, who's not here today, Emma's doing her PhD with us, and Emma's actually looking at digital literacy and digital citizenship, and even to the point that we need to be thinking, and we don't like to use the terms, but digital infants and digital babies, because even by the time they get to primary school, they're already engaged with the technology, they already have it. So if the curriculum's not ready for them, they're going to switch off and go, sure, that doesn't mean any sense to me. So that Emma's argument sort of is, this is great what Conor and Lucie have been doing, but that's after the horse has bolted. That's far too late. The things have happened. Let's actually build the coping skills in at the very, very start. Give them the coping strategies, the coping skills, and it may negate some of this, regardless of whether it's completely different or just the same as traditional bullying. Okay, so back to Lucie again, and I'll have a little think about Aidan for a couple of minutes.
We're usually much slicker with the changeover than this, but we're not used to Max. Okay. Okay, so talking about coping, we can look at it in a couple of different ways. Firstly, coping strategies that can be used to actually stop the victimization, to bring it to an end, and coping strategies that help young people to buffer the negative impact. So Conor and I have been working with some colleagues on a systematic literature review of cyberbullying and coping. And what we found through that process was that there's a massive amount of literature out there, loads of literature and lots of knowledge about how young people cope with both cyberbullying and traditional bullying. But the problem is there's so little evidence of what actually works. So we know what they do, but what's effective and what's not. We do have some insights, though, from previous research. So we know, for instance, that seeking social support, so going to friends and family, is found to buffer the negative impact. There was actually a really good study that Emma can probably tell you more about, because it was a collaboration between Headstrong and the School of Psychology in UCD. They did the My World survey in 2012, I think. And what they found was that one of the key protective factors for mental health in adolescents and young adults was the perception of the availability of one good adult, as they called it. So one adult you could go to in times of distress. That was a really important protective factor for mental health. One of the problems with cyberbullying is that the literature shows over and over again that young people are so reluctant to report cyberbullying to adults. So they feel that, number one, they might get in trouble because they were already doing something they shouldn't have been doing online that's led to this situation. They don't trust that their parents or teachers have the skills to actually help them. They don't have the technological know-how. And they're afraid that their technology will be taken away, so they're afraid that the phone or the laptop or the Facebook account will be gone if they tell them. So by having this knee-jerk reaction of, oh, just take it away or turn off the computer or close the account, we're really alienating them and taking away this really important coping resource. We also know that taking a kind of proactive approach where you try and solve the problem, or at least try and protect your own mental health by, say, engaging with hobbies, sport, music, something positive that takes you away from the problem. This tends to be effective. And we can't ignore technical coping. So when we talk about cyberbullying, you can put an immediate barrier between yourself and the bully by blocking them if that facility is possible. You can report abuse to a service provider like Facebook or Twitter. You can also sometimes delete nasty content. Sometimes you can save evidence if you need to go to the police or to the school. But sometimes this is regarded as like the perfect solution. And talking to parents, you get the sense from time to time that they come in and their attitude is just tell me what to do with the computer and we'll be grand. And it's not like that. There are so many other factors. And very often if you report something, you're dependent on the service provider to actually follow up on it. It's not always within your control. So it's an important coping strategy, but it's just one approach. We know that responding aggressively tends to cause the problem to escalate, and it certainly doesn't buffer the negative impact. And we know that being avoidant or passive, it certainly isn't helpful either. So in order to look at coping in our own research, we again used, this is a cyber-specific scale that was created by our colleagues in Switzerland. And they wanted to look at coping in response to a cyberbullying scenario. So we created two scenarios. In one, which we consider to be less severe, they had received a nasty text saying something like, everyone in school thinks you're a loser. In the more severe scenario, they were made aware that there was a video of them on YouTube where they were seen in an embarrassing state of undress. So we consider that more severe because it was very public and it was stronger content. So we had 6 subscales, and you can see that they were actually very consistent for both scenarios, what they recommended. But they tended to recommend assertive coping, so non-aggressively asking or telling the bully to stop would be an example of that. Actively ignoring, So not being passive, but sort of saying, no, that's not worth my time. I'm not going to come down to their level, so I'm not dealing with them. And close support, going to friends, family, etc. These were all highly recommended. They tended not to recommend seeking advice from like a helpline or the police. They tended not to recommend helplessness, which would be like self-blame or feeling there's nothing you can do about bullying anyway. And they also didn't recommend aggressive coping. So kind of bringing those three aspects we looked at together. Going back to the markers of mental health, we found that all forms of victimization were predictive of impaired mental health, but as I said, particularly traditional. Helpless coping, so this blaming oneself and feeling like there's nothing you can do, that was also almost as predictive as the victimization itself for impaired mental health. Retaliation was predictive of depressive symptoms, and then for protective factors, it seemed like coping assertively or seeking close support would predicted increased psychological well-being. So I'll hand back to Conor for the last time.
The last hour?
The last time.
Or the last time? No. I thought all my Christmases come at once there. Yeah, I think it's sort of hard to put across in an hour the sheer amount of work that has gone into some of this research, whether it's Lucie's research, the stuff I've been doing, or the European projects, and hopefully you get a wee bit of a sense of it, but we have a lot of publications, a lot of stuff available, and there's probably different parts of this that cut across everybody's kind of research strata here. So if anybody does want to talk to us about it, please do come, and we'll be happy to do that. And I suppose we get to the point now, well, what has been done? Because that's always the question. How do we counter this? How do we intervene? How do we prevent it? There is a lot of stuff being done, and it is classic of where we're at as educationalists and interventionists. You know, if we wait until we're ready, you know, we'll be waiting for a long time. And sometimes you just have to get the feet dirty and get out there and hope that we're doing the best. And I know that most of us are doing this kind of stuff. I know Aoife is trying to do this with the bereavement stuff, interventions for school that fit the curriculum. Lucie talked about the systematic lit review. Aoife's doing systematic lit reviews. We're all doing the same kind of stuff that we've been doing in this research. And I suppose we have to get busy. And we have been, and this is what the European projects have been about. We have developed the resources. We've made them free. They're there for parents, for teachers, for trainers. Everything's there. It's just a matter of people getting off their bum and getting out and using them. And, you know, there's a big call to parents to actually clue up in this kind of stuff. At some point, schools are going to have to say, we can't keep breaking the law ourselves by trying to deal with this stuff because we're overstepping the mark of where we're at. It does affect education, but at what point do we have to keep losing every Monday because teachers are dealing with what was happening in people's homes at the weekend? Can we confiscate phones? No, we can't. So those kind of things. And what will we then do after today, and what will you do? And what we're trying to hope is, again, as researchers, as educationists, we're trying to act as agents of change. We're trying to then influence our colleagues here who will influence everybody else that they're doing. So what is it that you're going to do? Are we going to build a world where our children are stronger than where we were? Will we give them those coping strategies, and will we help them to move on at school and everywhere else? So really the call is then today, from what we've been doing, what will you do as a person after today in relation to your interactions on the internet, Twitter, Facebook? What will you do as a member of society to try and push that wheel a little bit further? What will we all do then in terms of education? And regardless of whether we're, you know, psychologist, sociologist, philosopher, there's room there for everybody. I went off for coffee a couple of weeks ago with Katie, who's doing the PhD, and I got a whistle-stop tour of where Katie's at with the PhD and the philosophy stuff, which allowed me to come away and think a bit differently about what we're up to as well. And I think that's what's lovely about a kind of school that we have. We're all different flavours of M&Ms, so we can all learn from each other. So what is it that we're going to do to try and push this forward? One thing, everybody keeps beating up the government. Everybody keeps beating up schools. You know, why doesn't the government give us more policies? Why don't they give us this? Why don't they give us that? They're caught in the headlights as much as everybody else. And maybe it is a case if we all start to say, well, what can we do maybe we don't need all these policies. Maybe we just need to know what's right, what's wrong, what's moral, what's not, and actually just move on. It is that kind of thing for parents and for ourselves. If you don't know it, you can't teach it. And I would challenge everybody here, how much do you really know about Web 2.0? How much do you know about filtering? How much do you know about basic controls? And I know people are laughing at me here because I'm not brilliant at this kind of stuff, but I'm trying. And, you know, we have to learn this kind of stuff. iPads and iPad minis are not babysitters. When you talk to schools now, a couple of years ago, confirmation money was for mobile phones. Then it was for smartphones. Now First Holy Communion money is for iPads and iPad minis. And the rate of ownership is going down and down and down. But what do we as parents, adults, and responsible people in society know about the controls here? And as we would always say, you don't have to be responsible for the problem to be responsible for the solution. And that's what we're always trying to do. So trying to create upstanders rather than bystanders, and the importance of the dose effect. And we do know one of the huge things that protects children from any kind of bullying is the more good friends they have. And there is a dose effect there. And the importance of one good adult and the good work that Headstrong are doing. One of the best anti-bullying programs in the world, the Kiva program in Finland, built in self-efficacy, built on very, very basic principles. I know, I can, I do. If you can get kids to the point where they say, I know these things, to the point then they say, well, I could do that, then it's not a big jump to they actually do it. I know, I can, I do. And then all of the stuff that we have to do to get IT stuff, internet safety, and I'm sure lots of stuff that Elizabeth could drop in here. If Keith was here, he'd be dropping it in. There's so many parallels to what we're all doing. And I suppose I'll just finish off on behalf of myself and Lucie to say thank you. And, you know, this is where we're at. Let's have a look, but go out and see what's there. And I think, you know, come and chat to us if you want to know a little bit more about the bullying, the cyberbullying, or the educational stuff that goes behind that. And of course, there's links to drama and everything else that go on here. So, happy enough? Yeah. Thank you, folks. Thanks for listening.